Dominoes have this quality where you can set them up one by one, perfectly spaced, and they'll just sit there doing absolutely nothing until you tip the first one. Once that first one goes, you don't get to choose which ones fall next, because the whole line comes down on its own terms. Right now, the United States government is staring at a line of dominoes that stretches from the Treasury Department all the way to your retirement account, and one of them has already started to wobble. That wobbling domino isn't buried inside some obscure congressional bill that nobody reads. It is the interest payment on $36 trillion in national debt. In fiscal year 2024, the federal government handed over roughly $882 billion just to cover interest. Not roads, not schools, not fighter jets, just the cost of having borrowed money in years past. That number now exceeds the entire defense budget. And it is climbing faster than any other category of federal spending. I'm Sheila, and look, the reason I'm telling you this isn't to ruin your Tuesday. If you invest, if you save, if you're trying to build something real with your money, this is the single most important macro story sitting in front of you right now. That first domino doesn't stay in Washington. It ripples out to your mortgage rate, your portfolio, and the purchasing power of every dollar you've worked to earn. So let me walk you through how we arrived at this moment. Why the math turned brutal so quietly, and what it actually means for your money. Some of this is going to be a headache. I'll warn you now, but it is the kind of headache worth sitting with. The line of dominoes didn't appear overnight. And rewinding the clock makes that pretty clear. After World War II, U.S. debt peaked at about 106% of GDP, which held the record for decades. America grew its way out of that hole, not through painful austerity, but through an economic boom, a baby boom, and the simple fact that the country was the only major industrial economy left standing. Debt to GDP dropped steadily for 30 years, and things genuinely looked fine. Then the early 1980s arrived, and the dominoes started getting placed back on the table. Tax cuts under Reagan came first. War spending under Bush followed. The 2008 financial crisis hammered everything. And COVID emergency spending delivered the final massive wave. Clinton actually ran surpluses for 4 consecutive years in the late 90s. And that remains the last time black ink showed up on a federal budget. Over 25 years of red ink have followed, with the amounts growing larger each cycle. Here is where it gets really uncomfortable. During COVID, the government pushed somewhere around $5 to $6 trillion out the door in emergency relief. The CARES Act alone carried a $2.2 trillion price tag when it was signed in March 2020. Another round landed in December of that year. And the American Rescue Plan added $1.9 trillion. More in March 2021. A lot of that spending was genuinely necessary. Because people were losing jobs, businesses were closing, and hospitals were running out of capacity. But that much money pumped into the economy that fast had consequences. Nobody could outrun. Inflation hit 9.1% by June 2022, the highest reading in 4 decades. And to fight it, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve cranked interest rates from near zero all the way up to 5.25 to 5.50% by July 2023, the most aggressive rate hiking cycle in over 40 years. And here is the part most people miss entirely. Those rate hikes didn't just make your car loan more expensive. They made the government's own debt dramatically more expensive, too. Every time an old Treasury bond matured and got replaced with a new one, the replacement carried a higher interest rate than the one before it. The weighted average rate on all outstanding US debt climbed from around 1.5% to 2% in 2021, up toward 3.3% to 3.4% by mid-2024. And while that sounds like a modest shift, it is anything but modest when you're carrying $36 trillion every fraction of a percent translates into tens of billions in additional annual interest. That is the first domino tipping over. Not through some dramatic crash or a single headline, but through a slow, grinding mathematical reality that compounds on itself with every passing quarter. This is where the domino metaphor really locks in, because they don't just fall in a straight line. Each one knocks into the next a little faster than the last. Economists have a name for what happens when this dynamic takes hold inside a government's finances, and they call it the fiscal doom loop, which is about as cheerful as it sounds. The mechanics work like this. The government runs a big deficit, so it borrows more, and that borrowing at higher interest rates pushes interest payments up, which makes the deficit even bigger, which forces more borrowing, which means even more interest. The circle feeds on itself and speeds up the longer it spins. The CBO, which functions as the government's own nonpartisan accountant, projected that interest costs would blow past $1 trillion a year within the next few fiscal years if rates stayed where they were, $1 trillion annually, flowing straight to bondholders. For comparison, the entire federal education budget runs about $80 billion, meaning the interest bill alone would eat through 12 times that amount every single year. Before you close this video and start burying gold in the backyard, let me give you the counter-argument. Because smart people do push back on this framing. The United States holds something almost no other country possesses, and that is the world's reserve currency. Roughly 58 to 59% of all global foreign exchange reserves sit in US dollars, according to IMF data, which creates a built-in structural demand for treasury bonds from central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and institutions spread across the globe. The French actually coined a phrase for this back in the 1960s, when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it America's exorbitant privilege, meaning the US can borrow at lower rates than its fiscal situation probably deserves, because the entire global financial system runs on dollars, and that privilege is real and powerful. Japan carries a debt to GDP ratio of around 260% and hasn't experienced a sovereign debt crisis, so high debt by itself does automatically trigger collapse. But here is the thing, that privilege isn't locked in forever. China has been steadily trimming its treasury holdings from a peak of about $1.3 trillion down to roughly $770 billion. Central banks worldwide have been stockpiling gold at record rates, and the dollar's share of global reserves has slipped from 71% in 2000 to under 60% now. The exorbitant privilege still exists, but the cushion is getting thinner year by year. And if it ever thins fast enough, another domino tips. By the way, if this kind of breakdown actually helps you think about your money, instead of just reacting to whatever headline lands in your feed, hit subscribe. The algorithm tends to bury channels like this, unless people engage with them, and I would genuinely rather keep making these than pivot to reaction content about meme stocks. Okay, what does all of this mean for you? Because vague doom doesn't help anyone make a single financial decision. Let me get concrete. On the interest rate front, even after the Fed started cutting in September 2024, long-term Treasury yields actually climbed in the opposite direction. The 10-year Treasury yield, which serves as the benchmark for mortgage rates, and a huge range of other borrowing costs, rose from about 3.6% in September to around 4.5 to 4.6% by January 2025. That move is the bond market sending a message, saying we see the fiscal path ahead and we want compensation for the risk of lending to this borrower. If you're planning to buy a home, refinance, or take on any kind of long-term debt, that price signal hits you directly. when it comes to your investments. The government absorbing $1.8 trillion a year in borrowing means $1.8 trillion of capital flowing into treasury bonds instead of into private businesses. A dynamic economists call crowding out. Less capital available for companies to grow can weigh on stock returns over time, which matters if your retirement strategy depends on consistent market gains. And then there's the one that genuinely keeps me up at night. Social Security. The trust fund is projected to run dry around 2033 to 2035, according to the latest trustees report. And when that happens, benefits face an automatic cut of roughly 20 to 25%, unless Congress steps in. What most people don't realize is that the trust fund doesn't hold cash at all. It holds special treasury securities, and when Social Security redeems those to pay benefits, the Treasury has to borrow from the public to cover the redemption. That shortfall feeds directly back into the borrowing problem, which means yet another domino falls into the line. One more piece of this deserves your attention, and it might actually determine whether the dominoes keep falling, or whether something slows them down. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has individual provisions expiring at the end of 2025. And the CBO estimated that fully extending those cuts would add roughly $4 to $5 trillion to deficits over the next decade. That is a massive fiscal decision being made right now, as you're watching this, and it will directly shape whether the doom loop speeds up or whether policymakers find a way to pump the brakes. Scott Bessent, the current Treasury Secretary, talked during his confirmation about bringing deficits down to around 3% of GDP, which would represent meaningful progress. But 3% of GDP is still a deficit. The dominoes are still falling, and the real debate comes down to speed. Jerome Powell put it bluntly in 2024 when he told the public that the U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that debt growing faster than the economy is, by definition, unsustainable over time. Those aren't the words of a partisan commentator fishing for clicks. That is the chair of the Federal Reserve's speaking on the record. So here is what I want to leave you with. Panic is almost never the right financial move, and I'm not telling you to panic now. I am telling you to pay attention, because the first domino in this debt crisis isn't some future event that might or might not happen. It already tipped. It tipped when interest payments crossed $882 billion and became the fastest growing line in the entire federal budget. What we're rewatching now is whether the rest of the line falls slowly enough for policymakers to react, or whether the market forces the issue the way it did in the UK in 2022, when Liz Truss' unfunded tax plan blew up the bond market within days and pushed her out of office after just 45 days. America has more cushion than the UK had, thanks to the dollar's reserve status. But cushion is not armor, and this line of dominoes stretches a lot further than most people realize. So here is what I want to know from you. Do you think the US can actually grow its way out of this? Or has the math moved past the point where growth alone fixes anything? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read them. And honestly, some of the sharpest counter-arguments I've come across have come from people watching these videos. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time to fix that. I'll see you in the next one.